Today's story was very public and caused a lot of sensation. Let's look at all the circumstances of the case. Human cruelty sometimes exceeds all imaginable limits. The victim of our story today died a painful death in a fire, but the saddest part is that this all happened because of a loved one who betrayed her. Kimberly Antonicus was born in 1974 in New York, USA, and was the only child of the family. Her father, Thomas, was a tall, successful businessman. He initially dealt with real estate, but later, after their daughter was born, he began working with computers. This field was very promising. The family had more than enough money, and the loving father readily used it to fulfill his child's every wish. After some time, the parents divorced, and the child was left with her mother. During this time, she was only 1 year old. The girl had contact with her father only on weekends. Thomas cherished these short moments when he could take his daughter and spend free time with her. A few years later, the girl's mother decided to move to Florida, where she found a new man and wanted to start a family with him. At this time, the mother gave the girl the option to choose with whom she wanted to stay. Kimberly decided not to leave New York, where she had grown up, and so the daughter began to live with her father, with whom she got along very well. The daughter even jokingly asked her father not to remarry so that their relationship would not change negatively. When Kimberly was 20 years old, she was studying at college. She was considered an intelligent and lovable young beauty who was a lot of fun, open, sociable, and even a bit naive. Her parents surrounded her with care throughout her childhood, literally not letting her struggle with difficulties and solving everything for her. The dark sides of the world and people, all possible problems, passed by the young beauty, and thanks to this, she had an open heart. In 1994, Kimberly wanted to move into her own apartment and live alone. She asked her father, who was initially against it because he was very worried about his daughter's safety. But at the same time, he understood that she had to become independent and build her own life. The daughter was already 20 years old. He still cared for her and was very afraid for her, but he did not want to upset his daughter, so he agreed anyway. Later, they went into the city to look for suitable accommodation. For safety reasons, the man chose an apartment for her that was in a safe neighborhood of the city, and almost immediately after her move, he also bought her a garage space across the street so she could park her car. To stay in touch with her, her father gave her a mobile phone. It should be noted that we are talking about events that took place in the mid-1990s, before the advent of modern mobile phones and the active development of messaging apps. Back then, mobile phones looked different and didn't have the functions they have today. But the most important thing was that they offered the possibility to stay in touch with loved ones at any time. Computers were also not yet so widespread that it was not easy and was very expensive to get a mobile phone. This shows how much Thomas cared about his daughter's safety and how much effort he made. He even bought Kimberly a pit bull puppy because he assumed that his daughter would feel more comfortable with it, that the dog would grow up and protect her. The father had reason to worry, as he had protected his daughter for years and had more than once experienced how she chose unfortunate friends who hurt her. The man wanted to make sure she was safe, not knowing what hard trial life had in store for her. Thomas worried about Kimberly and repeatedly told his daughter that he wanted her to come back and live with him. He also offered her a job in the family business, but she refused because she wanted to find her own way in life. The father never pressured his daughter and wanted to give her free choice. Kimberly lived a typical college life during this time, with parties and entertainment and the desire to be free without parental supervision. She had recently taken a part-time job as an accountant in an office, but the people she trusted turned out to be real traitors. Unfortunately, she did not suspect what cruel end awaited her. On February 28, 1995, Kim went to another party. Usually, she went to such events with her friend Liz Pace. Here, the young women danced and had fun. The next day, March 1st, Kimberly was supposed to go to work, but her colleagues noticed her absence. They began to worry, and eventually, Kimberly's manager called her father. The employee began to speculate that Kimberly was simply sick and couldn't report to the office. But instead of confirming that his daughter was at home, Thomas panicked. Moreover, he hadn't heard from her since the evening of February 28th. The man tried to reach his daughter, but she didn't respond. He contacted all the friends of his daughter that he knew, but no one had seen her since she left the party early in the morning of March 1st. The alarmed father decided not to wait and immediately turned to the police. But unfortunately, he also received the usual response. The police officers noted that it was a young woman who had disappeared after a party. She was an adult and could do as she pleased. Legally, she could have stayed overnight at a friend's place and returned later. At least 24 hours would have to pass before she could be considered missing. This answer, of course, did not satisfy Thomas. So he organized his own search party, which included his daughter's friends. They first went to the parking lot near Kimberly's apartment. Here, it looked like she hadn't returned from the party. Her car, a '94 Honda Accord that her father had given her, was not in her parking spot. She was also not in the apartment. With this information, the man went back to the police station and insisted that something had happened to his daughter. The police officers, however, were unyielding. He searched various places where Kimberly could be and spoke to many people, paying special attention to the police officers and trying to draw law enforcement's attention to what had happened, until he finally met an investigator who was interested in the mysterious disappearance of the businessman's daughter. Like Thomas, he immediately had the feeling that something was wrong in this case despite the protocol. He said that immediate action was necessary and decided to personally help the father of the missing woman. The first thing the investigator had to do was to rule out all possible versions of the events. To do this, it was necessary to discard the possibility that she had run away from home. The investigator analyzed the transactions on the woman's bank card. It turned out that the missing woman had not used the card since the evening before her disappearance. The investigator called all the friends of the missing woman, but no one had seen her after her disappearance and did not know where she was. The police officer then determined the woman's daily routine to find out what she had done the day before. Perhaps there were some clues here. Quickly, it turned out that Kimberly had, on the morning before her disappearance on February 28th, attended college classes as usual. After the end of the school day, the student went to her work. After working a few hours, she contacted her friend Liz Pace. The two always went to parties together. They went to a party where they celebrated and had a few drinks, and around 4 a.m., they decided it was time to part ways. They then drove together in Kimberly's car to Liz's house, which was literally just a few blocks from Kimberly's apartment. Liz went home, and the missing woman set off for her apartment. Her friend never saw her again, so it was known that Kimberly had driven her car, even in a drunken state. Nevertheless, it was important to understand what happened to Kimberly after she dropped off Liz and drove to her parking spot. For this purpose, the police officer went to the missing woman's house and searched the garage area. The investigator tried to find any traces or markings that could help reconstruct the events of the morning when Kimberly disappeared. The only thing the investigator could find was a gold earring. The father confirmed that it belonged to his daughter's jewelry when he showed it to him. Liz confirmed that Kimberly had worn these earrings at the party. There were no signs of a struggle or tire tracks from drivers accelerating or stopping. The car seemed to have been stolen very calmly. But the found earring unsettled the investigators, and the suspicion arose that this was how the burglar made his profit. At this point, other police officers were involved in the case, as there was every reason to believe that Kimberly had been kidnapped. To find the white Honda, the police officers began to search scrap yards and all places where the car could be dismantled for parts or sold. But everything was in vain. The vehicle seemed to have disappeared. To get more help with the investigation, Thomas turned to his lawyers and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In fact, apart from the white Honda, there were few clues. Thanks to her friend Liz, it was possible to determine what clothes the missing woman had worn. And from her words, a portrait was created to notify the city's citizens and gather information. The investigators also learned that she had 2 tattoos. One was an infinity sign with a naked couple in it. The second tattoo showed a scorpion, her zodiac sign. The police officers then decided to gain access to the woman's mobile phone. For this purpose, they went to the woman's apartment, where there was a landline phone from which 65 calls had been made on the morning of the disappearance. But not even that caught the officers' attention, but rather the fact that Kimberly's apartment was not empty. It even hosted guests, namely, a whole family. April, her boyfriend Joshua Torres, and their 2-year-old child lived there. The family admitted that during this time, the floor in their apartment was being renovated, and they didn't know where to stay during the renovation work. But Kimberly welcomed them by providing them with a guest room. As it turned out, they had already been living there for several weeks before the investigators arrived. The family was also worried about the disappearance of the apartment owner and said that they had not heard from her since the evening when Kimberly went to the party. This all seemed very strange. The father of the missing woman knew about the befriended family that his daughter had taken in and had always been against it, but Kimberly didn't want to listen to him. She was reliable and couldn't let her friend down. Of course, the couple was questioned first, and the investigators wanted to know why so many calls had been made on the morning of the disappearance of the landlord. Joshua claimed he had started calling all of Kimberly's friends and acquaintances when the woman didn't come home on time. According to him, the student was like a little sister to him, so he took care of her and was worried about her disappearance. Kimberly's mother was informed about the incident on the second day after her daughter's disappearance and flew in immediately from Florida. The woman stayed in Kimberly's apartment, and the cohabiting family was asked to move out. They continued to be treated as suspects. The mother of the missing woman participated in the search for her daughter, and a friend advised her to contact a clairvoyant who could say more about the probable fate of the woman. In her desperation, the woman took up this idea. When the woman visited the clairvoyant, she showed her photos of her daughter and asked for help. The clairvoyant said that Kimberly was still alive but in great danger. Therefore, the search should not be delayed. The missing woman was weak and dehydrated. Moreover, Kimberly had been kidnapped by people she knew. Kimberly had tried to escape captivity but had been caught and tied up again. The clairvoyant kept repeating that she had seen the letter J in one of the perpetrators' names. Apparently, the main culprit in the events, the kidnapper, was a young man whose name began with this letter. The mother of the missing woman passed this information on to the police. It was even the only information the investigators had at this point, and they decided to use this lead. The next day, it was broadcast everywhere in the New York news and caused a stir in society. And soon, there was a new turn in the case. On March 4th, around 2 a.m., a major fire broke out on 68th Street in Woodhaven, Queens. A witness to the incident later said that shortly before the fire, he had been walking his dog, which behaved very nervously near the house and barked at it for a long time, even though the property seemed quiet. It was an abandoned house, but it was very large, so the fire attracted attention and several fire units were needed to fight the fire. When the fire was finally extinguished, the police and firefighters began to search the ashes, as it seemed that really no one lived here. But in the basement, an unpleasant discovery awaited them. Below lay a burned corpse that was so badly burned that one could hardly recognize it as a woman with long dark hair. The worst part was that she was tied to a chair. The medical examiners confirmed that the dead woman's hands and feet were bound, that she wasn't wearing shoes, and that her hands were still tied behind her back even after her death. So it was clearly a murder. It was determined that she was still alive when the fire broke out. Her lungs seemed filled with smoke. This means that she was burned alive. During the investigation, it turned out that an intruder had poured a flammable liquid over the house and then set it on fire. Due to the poor condition of the body, it was difficult to identify the victim. They assumed that the burned person was the missing Kimberly. To identify the body, dental records were needed. To do this, the investigator contacted the father of the missing woman and expressed his suspicion. When examining the mortal remains, experts found tattoos that were identical to those described by Kimberly and a match with the dental records, confirming the investigators' fears. The police tried to take fingerprints in the garage where the victim's car was supposed to be parked and at the scene of the fire. However, the forensic scientists were unsuccessful. The traces were simply not present. They were thoroughly wiped away, or the kidnapper wore gloves. It was now clear why a neighbor had always stopped with his dog in recent days when the animal had become restless. Kimberly desperately wanted to free herself and call for help, so she made noises that the animal could hear but were not perceptible to the human ear. The police officers immediately contacted the owner of the burned-down house. He was shocked by what had happened. He had offered the house for sale a long time ago and had not been there himself anymore, but from time to time his employees came to check the condition of the house. He took a quick look at the doors and windows to make sure everything was in order and also picked up the mail. In those days when Kimberly was being held in the basement, he also appeared here as usual. He inspected the house from the outside, picked up the letters and the payment notices, and then simply left again. Since he was outside, he could not hear the woman because of the city noise, who was probably calling for help at that very moment. The man would have only had to go into the basement. Then he would have immediately noticed that something was wrong. Unfortunately, the man did not do that. Kimberly was a step away from being rescued, but that didn't help. Since all possible evidence was burned, the victim's family and the police were forced to turn to a clairvoyant again. This time, the woman said she could see 4 people who might be involved in the events, and she repeated again that the name of one of them began with the letter J. But the clairvoyant statement alone was not enough to find the murderer. The father of the victim offered a reward of $75,000 for information leading to the capture of the perpetrator. The police continued to investigate and found out that the father had returned to his house on the day of his daughter's disappearance and listened to the answering machine recordings. Here, there were 2 strange calls when there was silence on the other end of the line. They later played an important role in the case. In the meantime, the investigators speculated that it could have been Kimberly who tried to contact her father, or that the burglars might have called him to demand a ransom. But something prevented them. Perhaps there were communication problems. When the public learned what had happened, numerous rumors arose that even accused the father of the murdered woman, Thomas, of being responsible for his daughter's death. Some claimed he was a wealthy businessman with connections to the local mafia. The police checked this information and, despite the businessman's denial, could prove that he actually had no connections to crime. Kimberly's car was soon found. The vehicle had been parked for several days in one of the city's quiet streets, quite far from the scene of the fire. The residents did not know that the car was being searched for, as no one had officially reported it. But since the car had no owner, the investigators found the second gold earring of Kimberly when they arrived at the scene and examined the interior and trunk of the car. Hair and fingerprints were also found. After that, however, the investigation stalled for a long half-year. In September 1995, new witnesses came forward, a man and a woman who reported to the police. The couple claimed that their mutual friend had bragged about the massacre of Kimberly. They told about the 22-year-old Joshua Torres, the same young man whom Kimberly had taken in. The investigators then met with him again and decided to ask him some questions. He began to tell that on the morning of Kimberly's disappearance, he had called many of her friends. The only one who didn't answer the phone was a Russian guy. According to him, he was one of the ex-boyfriends of the woman. Joshua claimed that the missing woman was afraid of him. He also told the police that on the day Kimberly disappeared, he had seen a group of suspicious Russians driving through the neighborhood where they lived. After Thomas found out about this, he decided to continue his investigations. He drove to the address where the man lived to speak to him personally. But he was not there. Instead, the man managed to talk to the young man's neighbors. They all agreed that he was a rather unpleasant person who didn't communicate much with others. But no one could help find him. Only the next day did Thomas confront the man and was able to persuade him to make a statement at the police station. There, the investigators found a tattoo on his leg with the abbreviation Kim, which presumably originated during the relationship with the victim. However, the young man denied this and stated that the tattoo was dedicated to his close childhood friend. After a short interrogation, The investigators did not find anything unusual. The young man claimed to have nothing to do with Kimberly's murder and had a solid alibi that was confirmed. The investigators were convinced that he had nothing to do with the crime. The police officers analyzed the calls made from Kimberly's apartment when she disappeared. It turned out that Joshua had lied. He claimed he had called the pager of the young man. These were widespread in the USA at that time and were used instead of cell phones. It turned out that Joshua had sent several suspicious messages on that fateful morning while he was in the missing woman's apartment. The man claimed he just wanted to stay in touch with friends and made some evasive comments. Joshua's behavior became increasingly suspicious. By the way, his name began with the letter J, and this letter was repeatedly referred to by the clairvoyant who had been contacted by the mother of the deceased. After the investigators learned more about him, they found out that the young man had no job. He lived off his girlfriend's money and took care of the child while she worked. All this made him an ideal candidate for the role of a kidnapper. He could, in his free time, plan a crime, locate the victim, and bring her to the abandoned house to demand a ransom. But something went wrong, and the perpetrator was forced to destroy all evidence in a hurry, along with Kimberly. The investigators told Joshua that they did not consider Kim's former Russian boyfriend a suspect in this case. He was grilled, and the man talked. Joshua began to tell a new story. He suspected that his friends might be involved in the events. In this case, it was about 3 men who had kidnapped Kimberly in the parking lot and put her in the trunk. The first was Julio, an acquaintance. Friends confirmed that he had been together with Kimberly for some time and even wanted to marry her. However, she was not interested in such a relationship, and the couple separated. Under police pressure, he confessed to being an accomplice in the kidnapping. He said he didn't know they would kill her. The kidnappers just wanted a ransom because they needed the money and wanted to release the victim, but the plan didn't work out. The police were able to confirm the suspicion relatively quickly. April remembered that Joshua and his friends were watching TV on the day Kimberly was reported missing. When the news about the suspect, whose name began with the initial of his name, was broadcast, one of them stood up, hurried out, and called the others after him. It was the 19-year-old Nicholas Liberté, who had the nickname Jay. Later that day, the body of the missing woman was found in the basement of the burned-down house. Could it be that the kidnappers were frightened by the excitement and burned the woman to leave no traces? In this group was also the 20-year-old Jose Rodriguez, who was not related to Joshua, although he had the same surname. All the people involved in the case, who later became suspects, were friends of Joshua. All had dark sides in their past that were associated with criminal matters. However, these were minor offenses that paled in comparison to the brutality inflicted on Kimberly. It was found that Nicholas had been released on bail before the kidnapping. He was still under police surveillance. On the eve of Kimberly's murder, he broke into a friend's house and tried to rob his mother at gunpoint. Instead of a 5-year prison sentence for such an offense, he got away with a $1,000 fine, thanks to his mother, who hired a good lawyer for her son. Apparently, Nicholas was then seized by a sense of impunity and therefore decided to carry out a more lucrative plan: the kidnapping of a businessman's daughter. The police found that Joshua was the initiator of this crime. He was the one who decided that it was possible to kidnap a rich woman who was a friend's friend and demand ransom from her father. The man controlled Kimberly's movements and warned the accomplices when she was supposed to return from the party. It turned out that Joshua had a rather turbulent criminal past. He had kidnapped children since he was 17 years old, but was quickly caught and arrested. Due to his young age and the complexity of the case, however, he only received 5 years probation. Later, Joshua was arrested for sexual assault of a minor, but only served 60 days in jail. A year later, he was again imprisoned for 18 months, this time for illegal possession of a firearm. It turned out that he formed a gang with his friends, whose members were called Mixed Breed. Unfortunately, the leader of the gang, Joshua, disappeared after he had contacted the police. The police officers decided to talk to Joshua's roommate, April. As it turned out, he used his girlfriend as an alibi. The man coordinated the actions of the criminals who were in the house. In fact, the criminal abducted the friend behind the back of his beloved, but she didn't even suspect it. Thanks to the messages on the pager and the testimonies of the criminals, the police were able to understand their criminal plan in detail. It also became known that they had followed Kimberly to the party. There, they behaved quietly and inconspicuously and simply waited for her to go home and immediately followed her. The 4 kidnappers were identified, but by this time, one of the people involved in the massacre, Jose Rodriguez, was already dead. On June 23rd, 3 months after Kimberly's death, he was attacked on the street while walking with a baby in his arms. He was shot in the back of the head from behind. No one saw the moment of the attack, but there was reason to believe that this was Joshua's way of silencing his accomplice, as he knew that Jose regretted it and wanted to go to the police. The remaining 3 were arrested and charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against their will. Later, they were able to talk to each other and create a complete picture of the events. In the garage where they waited for Kim after the party, the perpetrators used a gun and duct tape. The woman resisted when they attacked her. She kicked and scratched the intruders, even broke her nails. However, her strength was not enough, and she was tied up with duct tape, with her mouth, eyes, and even ears taped shut. Then she was completely immobilized and thrown into the trunk. The perpetrators brought the victim to an abandoned house, lowered her into the basement, and tied her to a chair. They took off her shoes so she couldn't draw attention to herself. They told her that her father owed them money and then left Kimberly there for the next 3 days. The leader of the gang instructed Julio to go into the house and take care of the woman, give her something to eat and drink. However, since he was afraid of being caught by the police, he did not do so. As a result, the woman neither drank nor ate, was freezing, and begged for help. Immediately after she was brought to the abandoned house, the criminals informed Joshua that everything was ready. Then he made a tape recording in which he demanded $75,000 as ransom. Joshua called Kim's father and played this recording on the answering machine. However, he did not choose the right time, so the recording was silenced. As a precaution, Joshua called again, but again, the timing was wrong, so no one heard the ransom demand and didn't know that the criminals were waiting for the money. Kim could hardly breathe through her taped mouth. She repeatedly lost consciousness, but was still fighting for her life. In the meantime, the kidnappers hadn't heard anything from the victim's father. They hadn't even noticed that he hadn't received their messages. Instead of checking whether everything was going according to plan, they became angry. Since the burglars never received the ransom, they decided to let Kimberly go. They went into the basement, but found Kimberly lifeless. Later, medical examiners found out that this was not the case. She had only lost consciousness due to exhaustion, cold, and lack of food and drink. In the days when no one was watching over her or giving her anything to eat, she had become very cold and weak. They had previously wanted to burn down the house to erase their tracks, but now it was decided to do so along with the hostage to eliminate any evidence. The public called the crime the most brutal in the history of Queens, and there were calls for the death penalty, which, however, was banned in the state. The most controversial defendant in this case was Joshua. He was not directly involved in the massacre, although he coordinated the actions of the gang members. His girlfriend, April, testified against him in court. She said he had personally confessed to her what had happened. After he had run her over to silence her, he went on the run, and the police had to try to lure the perpetrator out with a trick. They also used April for this. When questioned, Joshua said that he was neither involved nor complicit in the massacre of Kim and that the others involved, who were his friends, were the guilty ones. When he learned this, he decided to cooperate with the investigators and told everything. He repeated what he said in court. Thus, Joshua was found guilty on several counts, except for murder. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas received the same sentence and went to prison for 58 years. Julio, who was only found guilty of aiding and abetting murder, received a prison sentence of between 2 and 6 years. On his daughter's regular birthday, which took place after the conclusion of the trial, her father Thomas came to the grave to rejoice with Kimberly that he had finally been able to punish the guilty. Kim's father fought against the bitterness of loss until the end, but he died of cancer in 2005. Many were still convinced that the brutal crime had undermined the health of a loving father. Nicholas was mistreated and attacked in prison. 2 years after the start of his imprisonment, he died of AIDS. Julio served his sentence and was released 2 years later. Joshua can only be released in the year 2053. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.
When 22-year-old student Mindy Morgenstern suddenly stopped responding to messages and phone calls, her friends immediately became worried. Only a few hours later, Mindy's body was found inside her apartment. What the attacker had done to her was truly horrific. However, he left behind many small traces that helped investigators find him and determine exactly what had happened. It also turned out that the man who had taken Mindy's life had already been convicted several times for violent crimes. This crime took place in a city called Valley City in Barnes County in the state of North Dakota. Valley City is a tiny city with no more than 7,000 residents. It is a quiet place without major attractions, and in general, it does not draw much attention from tourists or the wider public. But that changed in the early autumn of 2006. On September 13, 2006, two of Mindy Morgenstern's friends, Tone Baumann and Danielle Holmstromsey, decided to visit her after she suddenly stopped communicating. Normally, she answered calls and messages right away, so her silence immediately caused concern. Her friends also knew that Mindy suffered from multiple sclerosis, so they went to check on her without hesitation, hoping to make sure everything was all right. When Tony and Danielle arrived, they knocked on the door. But again, there was only silence. Not knowing what else to do, they decided to try the door handle, and to their surprise, the door was not locked. Sadly, a terrifying sight was waiting for them just behind the door. Only a couple of steps from the entrance lay Mindy's lifeless body, and something was wrapped around her neck. Almost immediately, her friends realized that the young woman was already dead. The terrible news of Mindy's death quickly spread through the city, and soon police officers and detectives arrived at the crime scene. When they entered the home, investigators smelled a strong and distinct odor of pine sol, a cleaner commonly used in many American households. Because of that, one of the first questions that came to mind was whether the killer had tried to destroy evidence. During the examination of the body, police discovered that someone had stabbed Mindy in the neck with such force that the blade broke and remained lodged in her body. But in addition to the knife, the attacker had also used a belt to strangle the victim. After quickly confirming the identity of the 22-year-old young woman as Mindy Morgenstern, police officers went almost immediately to her family's home in New Salem to deliver the tragic news. Her older sister was the first to learn of the young woman's death, and her reaction was exactly what one would expect. A broken heart, pain, confusion, and anger were only some of the emotions Mindy's sister felt in that moment. Investigators were facing a difficult task. They had to find and arrest the person who had committed this terrible crime as quickly as possible. Mindy had been attacked and killed directly inside her apartment. Therefore, police first had to determine whether it had been a robbery, since that is the most common motive in crimes of this kind. Mindy's apartment was located on the second floor of a typical low-rise apartment complex, which meant it would have been much harder for the attacker to enter her apartment than the apartments of her neighbors on the first floor. As for the layout of the apartment, directly behind the front door was a long, narrow hallway filled with Mindy's shoes. To the right was her room, and a little farther to the left was the living room. The television, telephone, medication, and other valuables were still inside the apartment, which completely ruled out theft as a possible motive. Mindy's body was also found in the middle of the apartment, between the hallway, the living room, and the bedroom. This could have meant that she had been dragged into the apartment and had not been attacked while already standing there. But again, all of Mindy's belongings were still with her. So, what was the reason for the attack? And who could have done something so terrible? Before we get into the investigation itself, we should first explain more about who Mindy was. Mindy Morgenstern was born on April 29, 1984, in Bogotá, Colombia. She had an older brother and older sisters. However, a tragedy occurred in her biological family, and the details were not made public. Eventually, Mindy was adopted by Larry and Eunice Morgenstern. That is how she came to them, while her family settled in New Salem, only about an hour's drive from the place where Mindy later died. Mindy's friends and family described her as a caring and sociable young woman who was always eager to help others. After graduating from New Salem High School, Mindy studied physical education at Valley City State University. In 2006, she was in her final year of college and planned to pursue a career in sports. She loved basketball, was well known on local courts, and her childhood hero was Michael Jordan. All of this left no doubt about which sport she wanted to connect her life with. Sadly, it seemed that Mindy might have to give up those plans. The devastating diagnosis of multiple sclerosis severely limited her abilities in every sport. But Mindy did not allow the illness to stop her. She continued to stay active, coached a local basketball team, and worked as a lifeguard. Because of her illness, she lived in her own apartment rather than in a student dormitory. This separation was a way for her to manage her condition and the risks connected to the disease. The truth is that at the time of her death, Mindy was taking medication similar to chemotherapy, which her especially vulnerable to common illnesses she could catch from other people. In addition to her active social life and her education, Mindy also attended church services and played several musical instruments. She was an incredible person, actively involved in the life of her city and her community, and she cared deeply about others. Sadly, that beautiful and active life was cruelly ended by a brutal criminal. While Mindy's loved ones mourned her, investigators worked tirelessly to build a timeline of events, hoping it would help them find her killer. Investigators determined that nothing had been stolen from the apartment where the body was found, not even Mindy's purse, which was found near her. Through interviews with friends and family members, investigators learned that Mindy had spent time with her boyfriend the night before returning home shortly after midnight. Mindy's boyfriend was removed from the list of suspects after he showed investigators that she had called him that morning to tell him she planned to meet a friend at the library in the afternoon. The library computer system showed that Mindy had indeed been there and had logged off the computer shortly before 12:30 p.m. More precisely, records later showed that she logged off at about 12:23 p.m. After that, she went toward her apartment. This was confirmed through surveillance footage and witness statements. After that, however, nothing more is known with certainty about what happened to her. At about 12:47 p.m., contact with her stopped. No one saw her, and she did not appear on any surveillance recordings after that point. At 9 p.m. that same day, Mindy's friends arrived at her apartment and found her lifeless. Based on the timeline of that day, investigators determined that she had died sometime between 12:45 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. Investigators believed that she had been attacked immediately after arriving home, right after entering the apartment. Now they had to find the killer, but that was not an easy task. Mindy was very well liked by everyone who knew her, and everyone police spoke with seemed to have a reliable alibi. Mindy was first strangled with a belt, and then her throat was brutally cut, leaving a knife blade lodged in her neck. During the forensic examination, investigators found foreign DNA under the victim's fingernails. Police immediately suspected that it belonged to the attacker, and ultimately, this clue became crucial evidence. Fortunately, investigators were able to determine quickly whose DNA it was. Only about a week after the discovery of the body, the main suspect was identified and arrested. The suspect was Mindy's neighbor, a man named Mo Gibbs. Despite investigators' suspicions, Mo initially appeared to have an alibi. He also worked as a correctional officer at the Barnes County Jail. It is worth noting that applicants for such a position are normally carefully checked for criminal records and psychological fitness. The fact that he worked there after such screening surprised investigators. The alibi he initially gave authorities was soon disproven. At first, the man claimed that he had not even been near the apartment building on the day Mindy died. He said that he had been moving that day with his pregnant wife. Although part of that story was true, no one could confirm the man's location during certain periods of time that day, so investigators decided to look deeper. The investigation into the background revealed that he was far from as innocent as he wanted to appear. Very soon, gaps appeared in the information about his identity and his life, and investigators had to fill them in. It turned out that Mo Gibbs was not the man's original legal name. In fact, his name had been Glendale Morgan Jr., and he had changed it only 1 year before the events described here. Glendale had previously been an amateur boxer and, sometime later, had joined the Navy. His service in the Navy, however, was short-lived. The man carried out a deliberate attempted murder against one of his fellow servicemen. For that crime, Mo was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he was released early on parole after serving only 5 years. Once again, early parole played an important role in the life of both the offender and his victim. This was far from the first case in which a person convicted of violence was released and almost immediately committed another attack. The name change in 2005 was most likely an attempt to hide the conviction connected to that earlier crime. In fact, he succeeded. Neither his wife nor his employers at the jail knew about it. Police also learned more details about Mo's private life. It turned out that as early as 1991, when both were 18 years old, Mo had been married to a woman named Tasha. After his arrest in 1993, Tasha stayed with him and had a child with him, but in 1997, Shortly before his release, she filed for divorce. In 2002, Mo married again, this time to a woman named Melissa. However, that marriage also ended after only 3 years, in 2005. What is interesting is that although the two were still married, records show that 2 other women filed child support claims against Mo for children born in 2003. It therefore seems that this man was not only a criminal, but also actively unfaithful to his wife. Later, police found out that at least 5 women had requested child support from Mo even before he moved to North Dakota. In North Dakota, he met Jody, who was his wife at the time of Mindy's death. Jody claimed that Mo had admitted to her that he had a criminal record, but that he had not told her the real reason he had been imprisoned. As for his alibi, Mo claimed that he had worked at the Barnes County Jail until 7 o'clock that morning, between about 12:30 p.m. and 12:40 p.m. He drove Jody to work and then returned home to pack his belongings. Unfortunately for him, this matched exactly the time when Mindy was expected to arrive home and when contact with her stopped. Naturally, this information immediately caught investigators' attention. The autopsy report concluded that the probable time of death was between 12:30 p.m. and 1:30 p.m., which made Mo's possible involvement in her death even more likely. After that, investigators performed a DNA analysis on the material found under the young woman's fingernails. It turned out that it fully matched Mo's DNA. In addition, during questioning, investigators noticed that the man had fresh cuts on his hands, most likely caused by Mindy while she was trying to save herself. But the case did not end there. After it was confirmed that the DNA under Mindy's fingernails matched Mo's DNA, investigators discovered that his DNA also matched traces left by the offender in another case in the city of Fargo, not far from Valley City. In 2004, there had been a sexual assault case there. At the time, the offender could not be found, but now it seemed he would finally be held responsible for that crime. It is worth noting that Mo voluntarily gave his DNA for analysis. Therefore, it is unclear what exactly he expected. Given the physical evidence in the form of DNA, his proximity to the crime scene, the injuries on his hands, and his prior convictions, investigators believed they had finally found the killer. They also believed they had gathered all the evidence needed to prove his guilt in court. So, on September 21, 2006, Mo Gibbs was arrested for first-degree murder and was denied the right to be released on bail. But the man decided to harm Mindy again in another way. 5 days after his arrest, he declared that he was innocent, which meant he would have to stand trial. Fortunately, the prosecution was prepared for that turn of events and had already prepared the necessary evidence as well as additional charges. Several new and serious charges were filed against Mo. Among them were charges connected to his work. A total of 5 female inmates at the Barnes County Jail accused Mo of sexual assault, leading to several additional criminal charges. Because of the enormous attention this case attracted, the first trial was moved to Minnow and began in mid-2007. The first trial ended in June of that same year. However, even after more than 20 hours of deliberation, the jury could not reach a verdict. The prosecution portrayed Mo as a sexual predator and suggested that he had also tried to attack Mindy that day. But when she fought back, he decided to kill her in order to avoid another accusation. The defense, however, tried to refute that claim by questioning the reliability of the DNA analysis and emphasizing that fingerprints found at the crime scene did not match Mo Gibbs. In October of the same year, a new trial began, this time in Bismarck. This time, the jury reached a verdict and found Mo Gibbs guilty of Mindy's death. The man was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After that, Mo continued to insist on his innocence and even addressed Mindy's family. He said that his heart and prayers were with the Morgenstern family, that it was a terrible crime that never should have happened, and that he was sorry it had happened. Mindy's mother responded by saying that she forgave Mo, but added that she would never forget what he had done to her daughter. She then expressed compassion for the man's family and his children. Although Mo never confessed to killing Mindy, he did plead guilty in the previously unsolved Fargo case, and he also pleaded guilty to all charges of sexual assault committed at his workplace. The prosecution believed that Mo's actions showed a struggle with sexual addiction. But it is also worth mentioning that one of the assaults against inmates occurred on the same day Mindy was killed. As a result, Mo was also found guilty and sentenced for sexual assaults against 5 inmates at the jail, with those assaults taking place between May and September of 2006. In addition, he was also convicted in the previously unsolved Fargo case. For those offenses, Mo received additional prison sentences. All of his sentences were ordered to run at the same time. The crimes committed by Mo deeply shocked those around him. Many had known him as a dedicated, disciplined athlete who cared for his children. Mo Gibbs remains incarcerated in North Dakota. Despite their immense emotional pain, Mindy's adoptive parents found the strength to forgive. Eunice said that through forgiveness, they acknowledged what Mo had done, but rejected unnecessary hatred. Eunice channeled her grief into writing and later published a book titled Mindy. Although nothing can bring Mindy back, her family and friends find comfort in knowing that Mo can no longer harm anyone. Mindy Morgenstern was buried at Graceland Cemetery in New Salem, not far from the place where she had grown up. The people who knew Mindy promised to remember her as she had been in life, kind, sincere, and full of enthusiasm. The young woman's family created a heart-shaped memorial near their home with her name on it. To this day, that memorial stands as a reminder of what a kind and beloved person Mindy was. Thank you for watching, and take care.
Often, it's not even minutes but seconds that decide everything. If the main person in today's story had been home a little earlier or left a bit later, he might have been able to prevent the bloodshed. Unfortunately, his life was on the line, and the desire for revenge for his misfortunes was too great. At 11:35 a.m. on Friday morning, March 26, 2004, a call came into the police station in Dijon, France. On the other end was the worried voice of a man who didn't understand what had happened. He said he had come home from work and found the floors in the living room and kitchen covered in blood, while his beloved wife lay lifeless in the middle of the room. The dispatchers took the report and immediately sent paramedics and police officers to the scene. By 12:15 p.m., the gendarmes arrived at the farmhouse in the village of Lano. The first person they spoke to was the affected husband, Laurent Barry. The man was a 35-year-old chicken farmer. He wore clean clothes and waited outside the house for the police to arrive. He was in shock and couldn't explain what had happened, but immediately pointed with trembling hands at the house. The gendarmes went through the kitchen, where a struggle had apparently taken place. In the living room, They found the body of a woman lying in a pool of blood on the floor. According to Laurent, it was his wife, 38-year-old Valerie. She lay on her back. Severe head injuries were visible, as well as more than a dozen stab wounds. The worst injuries the woman had suffered were a slashed throat and a deep cut that ran across her chest and abdomen. The paramedics who arrived at the crime scene declared her dead, and the first signs of rigor mortis were already apparent. The woman had suffered such severe injuries that the upper part of her skull was partially separated from the rest of her head. The investigators immediately tried to find out what had happened in the house and contacted the widower. The man was in shock, made some incoherent remarks, and was obviously unable to control himself. The gendarmes suspected that he might have been involved in the massacre since he couldn't comment on the events. He was also the last person to have seen the victim alive. Usually, such people are involved in domestic murders. Most often, it's husbands who massacre their wives. Naturally, the investigators immediately decided to pay special attention to him. Laurent didn't believe that his wife was dead. Investigators had to repeat it several times until he finally stopped talking and thought about it. When the paramedics saw his condition, they offered to take him to the hospital so he could receive psychological help, and Laurent agreed. Only then could the police officers communicate fully with the man. An investigation was immediately launched. Right next to the body, they found a gun as well as a large butcher knife with a blade over 20 centimeters long. However, there were no fingerprints on the weapons, probably because the perpetrator wore gloves or had carefully wiped away all traces. In the hand of the deceased, a tuft of hair was found. Apparently, she had actively defended herself to save her life. Laurent's fingerprints were found in the kitchen, which seems normal since the crime scene was his own residence. It's logical to assume that the man actively used various items while living in the house, so this print was generally not suspicious. Nevertheless, the man remained a suspect, and the police officers were keen to communicate with him in an appropriate state. The first drops of blood were found in the kitchen, and it seemed that the attack had begun there. The victim managed to move into the living room, where she was found lifeless. The police officers suspected that she had suffered all 13 stab wounds there, which were later counted on her body by the medical examiner. Medical examiners worked at the crime scene to determine the time of death. Given the first signs of rigor mortis, death had occurred several hours earlier. However, the rate of decomposition is influenced by many factors that the experts had to consider: temperature, humidity, clothing, presence of injuries, and other factors. The medical examiner concluded that the woman died between 9 and 10 a.m. Of course, there's always some margin for error, so the circumstances of the massacre had to be clarified. The next day, police officers arrived at the psychological department of the Dijon hospital, where the main suspect was being held and treated. He had finally calmed down somewhat, regained consciousness, and could speak with the gendarmes. According to the widower, he got up early that fateful day because he wanted to deliver chickens to a customer. For this purpose, Laurent packed the goods and prepared them for transport. On that day, his wife took the day off because she was overworked and wanted to rest. According to her husband, Valerie wanted to use her free time to do a general cleaning in the room where she was later found dead. Around 9 a.m., the farmer got into his vehicle. Normally, he used a large van to transport the chickens, but that day the order was small, so he used a car. Laurent drove toward Dijon, where the customer's restaurant was located. The place was 56 kilometers away from the family's farm. According to criminologist calculations, the drive should have taken about an hour to an hour and a half. Laurent should have been there between 10 and 10:30 a.m. By that time, his wife was either already dead or desperately fighting for her life and losing the battle. It took about 10 minutes to hand over the goods to the customer, receive the money and the papers, and then Laurent went straight home. On the way, he stopped at the house of his mechanic colleague, with whom he chatted for about 5 minutes and invited him to visit in a few days. Around 11:30 a.m., Laurent was coincidentally back on the farm and made a horrifying discovery in the house. The farmer said that when he drove up to the house, he immediately noticed that he was not greeted by their dogs. The animals always greeted the owner with joy. The absence of the dogs alarmed Laurent immediately, but he couldn't suspect that the worst awaited him inside. The man tried to call out to his wife to open the door, but without success. That also seemed strange to him. When he finally reached the living room, he saw her lying unconscious on the floor and tried to speak to her. Of course, Valerie did not respond. Her husband felt that her body was cold and, shocked, threw his coat over her. The emergency call came in at 11:35 a.m. at the city emergency center. The investigators checked the man's statement and actually found him on the video recordings of the restaurant where he had delivered the chickens in the morning. The gendarmes spoke with the customer, who confirmed that he had accepted the goods and had a brief conversation with Laurent. According to him, the man appeared calm as always. He showed no aggression or fear and left immediately after receiving the money. Meanwhile, the medical examiner carefully examined the condition of the corpse and clarified the time of death. He estimated that the incident had begun around 10 a.m., and Valerie had taken her last breath around 10:30 a.m. Laurent was also carefully examined during his stay in the hospital. It was found that he had no injuries, not even the characteristic injuries one might sustain in a fight with a victim. They should have found some, because the woman defended herself fiercely and even tore a tuft of hair from the perpetrator's head before her death. Based on this data, the widowed farmer could be removed from the list of suspects. After consulting with the police, he was released from the hospital and went about his work. The man did not return to his farm, as it was morally difficult for him to stay at the scene of the massacre and constantly be reminded of it. So he went to his parents' house where their children lived. Laurent was in a very depressed state. His mother and father were worried that he needed to seek psychological help again and perhaps even take medication. By this time, the victim's relatives had also become aware of the incident. Everyone was shocked that a young, beautiful woman could be so brutally murdered in her own home. Most of the victim's relatives believed that Laurent was behind the crime. The police still did not have enough evidence to know in which direction the investigation should go. They considered the possibility that the attack might have been a botched robbery. Valerie was quite hot-tempered and had the misfortune of catching the perpetrator after he had broken into the house, and she might have tried to stop the thief, which could have cost her her life. The scattered furniture and belongings, the empty jewelry box, and other missing items seemed to support this theory. The police met again with Laurent at the scene of the tragedy. The widower was to examine all the belongings and provide a list of the stolen items. Laurent noted that 100 euros, a wristwatch, and clothing, including sportswear, were missing. It was strange that the attacker had taken such a high risk and killed with such brutality for such a small loot. From the outside, the house appeared unremarkable and not valuable enough for burglars to be interested in it. There were also no signs of forced entry. All this seemed unlikely, so the investigators dismissed the theory of a robbery. The investigators turned their attention to the butcher knife that was found on the floor next to the corpse. It turned out that it belonged to Laurent. It was a special tool for slaughtering chickens. Laurent said he had left it on the kitchen windowsill that day, as he often did, so the attacker could probably get to the huge cleaver as soon as he entered the house. He apparently grabbed it immediately and used the knife because he was afraid Valerie might try to defend herself. Another strange fact was that the family's guard dogs were locked in the shed at the time of the crime. This seemed odd and could indicate that the attacker knew the family well. The animals probably trusted him and let themselves be locked up. The attacker had thus protected himself against an attack by the dogs. Laurent thought that Valerie might have locked up the animals herself because they did not obey her and only obeyed him. Sometimes she locked them in the shed so that the dogs wouldn't cause her trouble. The police tried to find a likely motive for the murder in the deceased's past. It was suspected that it might have been an act of revenge triggered by an old grudge or jealousy toward the woman. After analyzing the victim's life, The investigators concluded that Valerie had a flawless resume and no serious conflicts. The woman worked in a hospital, and everyone who knew her described her as a friendly and smart person who did not seek confrontation and was calm. Nevertheless, close friends of the victim reported several suspicious moments. According to them, Valerie had become much more nervous and withdrawn in the weeks before her death, as if she feared something. Unfortunately, all questions from colleagues on this subject were simply brushed aside. The last suspicion against the widowed farmer was dispelled by the DNA analysis of the tuft of hair found in the dead woman's hand. It did not belong to him, so the man was removed from the list of suspects. In fact, the investigation had stalled, as there was no match in the police databases with the DNA traces. The law enforcement officers spent 3 weeks in this limbo. During this time, the story of the brutal attack on the farm became known throughout the country. People retold it with gruesome details and rumors. The fact that the police failed to stop the perpetrator eventually caused a slight paranoia among almost all the residents of the small community. However, this also had a positive effect on the investigation. During this time, an anonymous witness came forward at the station. The woman was afraid to give her name because she feared for her life. Later, she did reveal her name. The informant turned out to be a tobacco shop saleswoman named Josette. According to her, shortly before noon on the day of the massacre, a suspicious man entered the store where she worked. She did not know him, and he seemed to be injured. His left arm was bleeding. When she looked more closely at the injury, she found that the wound looked like a bite and was very deep. The skin and flesh were torn. In addition, the man had numerous scratches. Josette offered to help him, but the stranger refused and hurried away after buying a small item. Unfortunately, he paid in cash, so he could not be tracked, and there were no cameras. The witness gave a detailed description of the man, whereupon the police officers began to search the neighborhood and question all the residents. Unfortunately, this interrogation did not bring any tangible progress in the investigation. No one knew a similar man. Laurent had his own speculations about who might have committed the brutal massacre. In his opinion, only his former business partner Pierre, with whom he had run a farm for a long time, could have been involved. The businessmen had had a serious quarrel and had gone their separate ways when this man had demanded a large share of the company. Naturally, the former partner knew the farm well and could even remember Laurent's peculiarities, such as his habit of leaving a large butcher knife on the windowsill. As a possible motive, he suspected not only a financial dispute, but also jealousy. According to the widower, Pierre repeatedly flirted with Valerie, which she took negatively. The husband noticed how tense she became in his presence. Of course, the police immediately summoned him to the station to talk to him. Pierre was asked the usual questions to find out what he had done on the day and at the time of the murder. It turned out that he did not have a solid alibi. The man remembered that he had left the house around 9 a.m. and arrived at his father's house around 10:30 a.m. This time window coincided with the period in which the perpetrator killed Valerie. Moreover, the father's house of the suspected murderer was much closer to the restaurant where Laurent sold chickens. Theoretically, he could have been at the crime scene at the right time. However, his alibi was later confirmed because neighbors and his father had seen him. The disgruntled ex-partner gave the investigators strange information. According to Pierre, the couple was on the verge of separation, which is why he tried to hit on Laurent's wife. He said Laurent repeatedly talked about his desire to divorce his wife and run the business alone. Although Laurent was no longer questioned by the police, the gendarmes decided to take a closer look at the case files. Laurent and Valerie met in 1997. At that time, she was 31 years old and Laurent was 28. The woman worked as a nurse in a local hospital and also cared for several clients at home. She was divorced and raised a small son alone. Laurent had also just separated from his previous wife, with whom he had 2 children who lived with their mother. During their acquaintance, the man and woman found many things in common and decided to enter into a relationship. On September 19th, 1998, the happy couple celebrated their wedding. Less than a year later, their daughter was born. After these events, the Berry couple decided to settle in a farmhouse on the outskirts of a small village, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Laurent decided to start an agricultural business and trade in chickens and rabbits, which he raised himself and sold to restaurants. In the initial phase, the business was going very well, and he was even able to pay off all his loans early. Unfortunately, in 2003, a drought broke out, and the profitable business suffered great losses due to the high mortality rate among the chickens. During this time, Valerie continued to work in the clinic, but this only slightly eased the financial problems. The nurse's salary was not enough to pay all the debts and bills. To support her husband during this difficult time, she began to work overtime. Many people said that Valerie looked very tired. She clearly lacked rest. Moreover, the problems that arose were not solved as a result. The physical overload led to a serious conflict. In the fall of 2003, the Berry family almost broke apart. They could not agree because it was about finances. The woman thought Laurent should leave the farm and look for a job for a while. The man was sure that everything would return to normal. The children and the wife lived in the house, and Laurent even slept separately from his wife in his delivery van. Thus, the police became aware that there had been an obvious and quite serious crisis in the couple's relationship a year before the death. Since Valerie had been killed with one of her husband's knives, he was now at the top of the list of suspects. The gendarmerie found that the motive seemed far-fetched, and the man also had a confirmed alibi. Moreover, most acquaintances did not consider Laurent to be angry or aggressive despite his complex character, and he did not tend toward violence. Nevertheless, they decided to investigate his personality further. Apparently, the murder might be related to receiving insurance payments. The law enforcement officers checked this version, but could not find any life insurance policies for either spouse. In October 2005, almost a year and a half after the brutal and cold-blooded massacre of Valerie, the investigators discovered something unusual. Until then, the gendarmes had overlooked a small detail. A recording of Laurent's emergency call showed how he told what had happened and then began to call loudly and look for his dogs. Remarkably, at that moment, their distinct barking could be heard nearby in the background. During the interrogation, however, the man claimed that the animals had been locked in the shed since his arrival and had not even greeted him because they were far away. But the distinct barking of the dogs contradicted his words. The animals were not locked up at the time of the emergency call, but why would they have been locked up afterward? Why lie if there's nothing to hide? To get to the bottom of this oddity, the investigators decided to re-examine all the documents and evidence collected during the investigation. In doing so, the gendarmes discovered that the dates on the invoice that Laurent had printed out for his wife to fill out did not match the time he had indicated. According to the widower, he had created the invoices in the morning before leaving for the restaurant. But in fact, the documents were printed around 11:30 a.m. before the call to the emergency services. The police concluded that the husband was trying to cover his tracks in this way and lead the investigation into a dead end. Could it be that the medical examiners had misjudged the time of death? If so, he might have tried to convince the gendarmerie by printing the documents that Valerie was still alive when he left for the restaurant. In fact, she might already have been lying in a pool of her own blood in the farmhouse's living room. On the instructions of the Dijon prosecutor's office, criminal proceedings were initiated against Laurent. On January 17, 2006, the man was arrested. The interrogation lasted 26 hours. Initially, everything went smoothly. The main suspect did not plead guilty. However, he practically gave the police no direct answers to their questions, but thought long and hard each time and was obviously trying to hide something. The gendarmes were particularly interested in the watch that, according to Laurent, had been stolen from the house. When the police arrived to arrest him at his parents' house, where he was then living with his children, his room was searched. The watch was found there. The suspect stated that he had made a mistake when compiling the list of stolen items and had later found the watch in his car, but had not reported this to the police. The investigators pointed out further inconsistencies in his statements. In the middle of the interrogation, Laurent began to break down. Finally, after more than 24 hours with the investigators, the man admitted to staging the crime scene, but not the murder. He confirmed that he had locked up the dogs before leaving alone that morning because his wife had asked him to, as they bothered her. But he couldn't explain why he had lied on this point. The gendarmes were still convinced that he had lied on other points since the dogs had been nearby at the time of the emergency call, which meant that he had locked them up after the call and before the arrival of the police. The investigators suspected that he wanted to divorce, but feared an impending separation of assets. So the murder occurred when an argument broke out and Laurent lost control and stabbed his wife multiple times. The man immediately realized that the injuries were too severe to save the woman. He decided not to confess his deed and tried to make it look like a robbery. Laurent did not deny that he had removed some items and locked up the dogs, but he considered the other accusations of the investigators to be absurd. The gendarmes insisted and asked how Laurent had attacked his wife and how long it had taken him to thoroughly remove his traces from the crime scene. He repeatedly insisted that Valerie was still alive when he left for the restaurant and that he had nothing to do with the murder. Subsequently, all information was reviewed once again. It turned out that the medical examiners might have been wrong. Initially, the report stated that the victim had died around 10:30 a.m. In fact, the expert had not considered some factors, and the time span was much longer. Thus, it was possible to compare all the facts and obtain new data. According to the results of the new forensic examination, it was determined that the woman died around 8:30 a.m. Although the medical examiner's error was 2 hours, this error could play a significant role in the case. In view of the new facts, the widower had no alibi. Moreover, according to his statement, the man was clearly at the crime scene since he left it at 9 a.m., which means that he either killed his wife himself or witnessed the attack. However, since no traces of the presence of strangers in the house could be found, everything boiled down to the fact that the husband was the murderer. The gendarmes then turned to the old testimonies of Valerie's relatives. Even a year and a half later, they reported that Laurent was a rather unpleasant person, rude and aggressive. The victim's relatives knew that the relationship between the spouses could end badly and therefore suspected the man of the murder from the beginning. On February 17, 2006, 2 years after Valerie's death, the widower was charged with premeditated murder. During his imprisonment, Laurent's mental health deteriorated. The once successful farmer made several attempts to end his life voluntarily. At the same time, he insisted on his innocence. Laurent refused to make a confession and maintained that his apparent confession was the result of an interrogation lasting more than 24 hours under high pressure, during which he was simply confused and broke down. The defense attorney tried to highlight Laurent's best qualities during the trial. He emphasized that he was a hardworking, proactive, and reliable man like any other. He might get upset, but was clearly not capable of a bloodbath. Some acquaintances of the couple agreed with this view and believed that the widower was simply not capable of murder. The defense attorney relied on the testimony of a saleswoman who had seen a suspicious stranger with a bite wound in her store. According to the witness, it was not Laurent, but another man she did not know. The defense believed that this was the murderer. The prosecution argued that the appearance of the stranger with the wound was a pure coincidence and had nothing to do with the woman's murder. The prosecution relied on the opinion of the victim's relatives to prove the opposite. 10 months after the start of imprisonment, the defendant's lawyers applied for the man's release. According to the defense, they could find evidence that their client had been wrongly convicted and that he needed medical treatment. In conversations with neighbors of the Berry family, some strange things were learned. It is known that Laurent used his wife's car on the morning of the murder to bring the order to the restaurant. However, several neighbors confirmed that the delivery van, which remained on the farm, changed location between 10 and 10:30 a.m. At the same time, Laurent was not in the house and could not have done this. His absence from the house could be proven. Moreover, the police officers who arrived at the scene touched the hood of the delivery van. It was still warm, as if it had just been used. Since the car keys were not missing, only Valerie could have used the vehicle. This suggests that she was alive before 10:30 a.m., was out and about with the car, and was attacked only afterward. The defense attorney argued that the bloodbath took place shortly before her husband's arrival. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was of the opinion that Laurent himself could have driven away the car after his arrival and locked up the dogs. The defense attorney pointed out further inconsistencies. The victim had obviously defended herself fiercely, but Laurent was uninjured at the time of the police's arrival. He did not have a single scratch, which is simply impossible. And in the murdered woman's hand was a piece of foreign hair from the perpetrator, whose DNA profile did not match Lawrence, which means that the murderer was an outsider. The prosecution, however, questioned this point. The perpetrator had carefully wiped all traces from the murder weapon, but somehow forgot to take his hair with him. It seemed as if the hair had been intentionally placed in the victim's hand to mislead the investigation. The defendant's relatives confirmed that the couple had had problems and was on the verge of divorce. But about 5 or 6 months before the murder, there was a reconciliation between the two. There were numerous witnesses who had seen the couple together at Christmas. On the outside, everything seemed fine in the relationship, and the spouses even began again to prepare nice surprises for each other before the holidays. This was partly because the financial crisis in the family had been overcome and things were improving. On December 28, 2006, the farmer was released from prison on bail. He was kept at home until the resumption of the trial in October 2009. The prosecution insisted that microscopic traces of the deceased's blood had been found on his slippers. The defense believed that the blood traces could have appeared on Lawrence's shoes when he entered the house and found his wife lifeless. The defense attorney pointed out the irregularities committed by the medical examiners in their work. Initially, the house was not sealed off. The investigation of the crime scene did not begin immediately. When the results of the forensic examination were presented, the police officers had to revisit the crime scene, but most of the traces turned out to be contaminated and even wiped away. This was because the area of the house was not shielded from outsiders. Lawrence's mother arrived while her son was recovering in his parents' apartment to carry out cleaning work. According to the woman, blood appeared on her son's shoes when she wanted to clean the house and used his slippers. This happened a few weeks later when she could re-enter the house, so she might have stepped on the blood several times while mopping the floor. The lawyers accused the police officers of negligence in monitoring the scene of the massacre as well as negligence in the investigation. The man's natural calmness had played a cruel trick on him. The prosecution and the jurors noticed how impartial and cold-blooded he behaved during the trial, even though it was about his wife. Although Laurent claimed to have loved her very much, he showed no great remorse over her death. His state of shock on the day of the murder was not mentioned in court. The biggest problem for the defense attorneys was what Laurent had said during the 24-hour interrogation. Although he refused to confess to the murder, he was led to agree with some conclusions of the investigators, particularly regarding the staging of the crime scene. Laurent claimed that all this happened under duress. He had only lied to get the whole thing over with. The prosecution demanded 20 years in prison. After 5 days of deliberation, the jurors came together to reach a verdict. On October 23, 2009, Laurent Barry was found guilty of the murder of Valerie after 4 hours of deliberation. When he heard the jury's verdict, he dropped his head into his hands and wept. His lawyers promised to fight for the man's freedom until the end. A year later, an appeals court confirmed the conviction, but the widower continues to assert his innocence. In his opinion, the real murderer is still at large. Many agree with him and do not believe that Laurent is behind the crime, as there is no direct evidence against him. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.
Even if money does not solve everything, it at least helps with many problems. But it certainly does not turn bad people into good ones. The central figure of today's story was a rich man, but also a very bad one, and unfortunately, his wealth only worked to his advantage. The small town of Brentwood is about a 20-minute drive from Nashville. This place is known for its natural beauty and is ranked among the 20 wealthiest and most prestigious places in the United States. With a population of about 40,000, the town is considered one of the safest. Since its founding in 1969, only 8 murders have occurred there. In fact, Brentwood is regarded as one of the safest places in the country. It has luxurious parks, numerous restaurants, and clubs for wealthy guests. In addition, the headquarters of many large manufacturing companies, including international organizations, are located there. Despite this reputation, even in such seemingly paradise-like places, real nightmares can happen. The home of Rachel and Randolph Maidens was located inside the guarded Governor's Club, a country club community on a hill. The estate covered a total of 600 acres and included an award-winning private golf course. The Governor's Club was one of the wealthiest and most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. The couple's villa was enormous and cost a fortune. It seemed like a real fortress where someone could start a family and run a business. Rachel Elizabeth Frisbee Maidens was a 34-year-old orthodontist who had her own private practice in the city's business district. She was a very beautiful woman, naturally blonde, and a devoted mother to her daughter, Natalie. Rachel attended a Catholic private school in Nashville, then went to Birmingham Southern College, followed by dental school at the University of Florida. Throughout her education, Rachel's received numerous awards. The successful beauty also achieved success in tennis. Her accomplishments included a prestigious scholarship, and the crowning achievement of her academic success was completing her orthodontic residency at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Despite her young age, Rachel had a brilliant career. Thanks to her success, she managed to open her own practice. She began publishing articles in professional journals and regularly gave lectures at conferences. However, not everything in her life was so successful. While she was still studying on December 3, 2003, her father, Richard, was arrested for selling oxycodone. He had been a respected pharmacist, but he became involved in the illegal trade of prescription drugs. Although law enforcement had only just begun investigating his case, he was so afraid of losing his reputation that he took his own life only 2 days after his arrest. The family's nightmare did not stop there. The police continued investigating all family members. The bank accounts of Rachel, her mother, and her brother were seized. The investigations dragged on for several years. Rachel's mother was fined $115,000, marking the end of that dark phase in their lives. Many close friends and family members claimed that all of this caused great harm to Rachel's emotional state. However, it did not stop her from pursuing professional success. She endured all of these difficulties with strength and continued to build her own career. She still wanted to be the best in her profession. Striving for wealth and independence, she managed to overcome the family's financial crisis and the terrible loss of a loved one. After that, she rebuilt herself and took her life back into her own hands. Her husband, Randy, as he was known in his close circle, grew up in Georgia. After high school, he attended the Georgia Institute of Technology. Gradually, he became a well-paid pharmaceutical sales manager. But by the time of the tragic events, all of that had collapsed, and Randy was unemployed. Only 3 months before the events described in this story, a noticeable change in his behavior had occurred, causing many problems. Rachel reported that he quickly descended into uncontrolled alcoholism. There was also suspicion that he was simultaneously consuming various medications, which worsened the harmful effects. During this period, several witnesses saw him enter a restaurant, heavily intoxicated, harassing customers and staff. One of the employees felt forced to call the emergency number 911. The young woman who made the emergency call identified the man as Randy Maidens because he had eaten there several times with his wife. A few minutes after the first call, she called emergency services again because she became even more worried. She said that several suspicious items had accidentally fallen out of the man's bag, including a shotgun and a suspiciously large bottle that looked like the painkiller Tylenol. The rude guest gathered everything and then tried to leave the establishment. The waitress managed to persuade him to stay. The patrol officers who arrived at the scene immediately noticed that the man was behaving inappropriately, but they could not say for certain whether he was drunk or under the influence of something stronger. Randy became anxious. He wanted to leave, claiming that his wife had called him and asked him to come home. The waitress offered to contact his wife, but he refused to provide her phone number. The man tried to get into his vehicle, but the police officers did not allow it. During the search of his car, another shotgun was found on the back seat. Despite these strange circumstances, the man was not arrested. Several witnesses saw him being picked up by someone in a car that evening, someone who would never have allowed him to drive while intoxicated. When Randy found himself in such situations, he always asked that no one call his wife. He complained that he was often the victim of her anger and that he was afraid of upsetting her. Considering his inappropriate behavior, this reaction seemed quite natural. On the evening of April 21, 2013, Rachel's mother, Elizabeth Betty Frisbee, called the Brentwood Police Department and asked officers to check on her daughter's property. She immediately said that Randy was on the verge of taking his own life. She was worried because she could not speak with Rachel. Betty had tried calling her daughter for a long time, but the phone was answered by Rachel's husband, who refused to hand the phone to his wife. Finally, Betty lost her composure and threatened to call the police. That did not work, so she had to keep her promise. The officers arrived at the house within minutes and immediately noticed that the curtains were drawn throughout the home. Since no one responded to their knocking, there was no way to see what was happening inside. Fortunately, the garage door was open. The police officers entered the house and called out the residents by name. Neither Randy nor Rachel answered. Suddenly, a child responded to their calls. A 2-year-old girl named Natalie was on the first floor, crying. The child refused to say what had happened and kept repeating the same sentence through tears. "Daddy is gone. Daddy is gone." During the inspection of the house, one of the officers stepped into the large hallway. Leaning over the balcony railing, he saw a blood-spattered wall and a shotgun lying on a couch on the ground floor. Rachel was found in the corridor between the living room and the hallway leading to the master bedroom. She showed no signs of life. She had been shot as if in a shooting gallery. 8 shots from a 9mm pistol and 2 shotgun blasts to the back. The victim was wrapped in a blanket. The investigation made it clear that someone had tried to wipe blood from the walls. Invisible stains were left on the floor. Naturally, the murdered woman's husband, Randy Maidens, was immediately placed on the wanted list. Helicopters and SWAT teams were deployed to prevent the suspect from escaping. The upscale residential area looked like a Hollywood blockbuster. Police officers actively worked with the victim's neighbors, trying to find out where the man might have gone. When the victim's mother heard the shocking news, she immediately came to pick up her grandchild. Her son-in-law was considered especially dangerous because of his recent inappropriate behavior. It was expected that he would remain armed, which is why a warning was issued. Neighbors of the family confirmed that they had seen the fugitive on many occasions in an inappropriate state. A note was found on the kitchen table inside the dead woman's villa. In it, Randy apologized repeatedly to his daughter and confessed that he loved her very much. He wrote that he was forced to flee because of his terrible deed, but he did not say exactly what he had done. He thanked all of his wife's relatives for the years they had given him. Randy confessed that he could no longer endure the humiliation he claimed to experience daily from his wife. He wrote that since the beginning of their relationship, she had emotionally destroyed him every night and treated him like dirt. After 7 years, he had simply lost patience. On that fateful evening, he claimed, his wife had started to harass him in the same way, and that was the last straw. The father said he wanted to take care of his daughter, Natalie, and apologized several times to the child because he could not take it anymore and had given up. He also emphasized that he did not want the girl to stay with her mother and asked that custody be transferred to Rachel's relatives on her side of the family. When experts examined the contents of the letter, the main suspect was still on the run. According to some experts, his letter could be interpreted not only as a confession, but also as a farewell note. This made the search efforts even more complicated and suggested that the man might already be dead. Strangely, a car belonging to Randy was parked in the driveway of the property. Inside, officers found $7,000 in cash in a large bag in the trunk. Another large amount of cash was found in the house. By checking phone records, officers determined that Randy had called his lawyer on the evening of the murder. Apparently, the man's original plan may have been to kill his wife and then leave with the money to start a new life. But then something went wrong, and he wrote the letter. Perhaps it was only staged to cover his tracks. But then, why did he not take his car? What could have stopped him, especially since he still had enough time? Law enforcement suspected that it may have had something to do with Betty's calls. She called the police, and that could have ruined the criminal's plans. To the surprise of the police, the search did not last long. 12 hours after the search for the killer began, Randy simply came out of the woods behind his house with his hands raised. He surrendered to the authorities without offering resistance. He immediately accused his wife of psychologically harassing him for years. He claimed that the pressure had become especially intense after he lost his job. Because of this alleged behavior by his beloved wife, he said he had practically slipped into life on the edge of society. In his defense, Randy said that he was Rachel's third husband because the others had not been able to endure her constant nagging either. However, this in no way justified 10 cowardly shots into his wife's back. The criminal had barely had time to process the consequences of his restaurant incident 3 months earlier, and now he was also facing a charge for murdering his wife. It became known that he had recently come into conflict with the law several times for minor offenses. Specifically, he had been stopped in his car a few months before his wife's death while intoxicated. Because of the strong smell of alcohol, the police officer was convinced that Randy was drunk, but he refused to take a test. Under the law, this was equivalent to drunk driving. Later, he was involved in a car accident for the same reason. He was so drunk that he crashed into a power station and left almost 200 homes without electricity for several hours. A few weeks before Rachel's murder, a neighbor saw a stranger wearing a ski mask and accompanied by 2 dogs running through the woods. It was the same place from which Randy later emerged when he surrendered to the authorities. The neighbor spoke to the stranger and recognized Randy. She approached him to find out what was happening and immediately realized that he was heavily intoxicated or under the influence of some substance. Randy told the neighbor that he had been walking his dogs and had gotten lost, so he had walked toward her property. According to the woman, at that time, he had something like a bow and arrows in his backpack, so she hurried away. Later, he was seen many more times engaging in similar activities, which deeply unsettled the residents who lived near the maiden's residence. They feared for their safety. At the end of March, trespassing proceedings were initiated against Randy in Florida, but he got away unscathed. The investigations were simply covered up. He was probably saved by money. The most disturbing incident occurred in January 2013 during a work conference in Orlando, which he attended with his wife. One evening, he visited a bar and became so drunk that he could no longer speak coherently. The establishment's staff asked him to leave, but he began smashing dishes and cursing. Several people heard him simultaneously threaten to kill his wife, but no one took these drunken threats seriously. Several guests tried to intervene and escort the raging man out of the bar, but Randy started fighting, so the police had to be called again. He was eventually arrested for disorderly conduct and consuming alcohol in public, but he was released the next day. His employer learned about the incident. The pharmaceutical company was concerned about its reputation, and Randy's inappropriate behavior was taken very seriously. One of his colleagues, who wished to remain anonymous, advised him to take temporary leave for health reasons. However, Randy did not listen and returned to work 3 days later. As a result, he was fired. During the investigation, the police conducted numerous interviews with the killer's colleagues, all under strict confidentiality. The organization's management threatened to fire anyone who openly discussed the incidents involving their alcoholic employee. According to these individuals, the perpetrator's behavior had changed drastically in the months before the incident with his wife. At the same time, Randy himself did not explain what might have caused this change. He always complained about his wife and blamed her for everything. However, everyone around him found it hard to believe that his wife could have pushed him that far. Rachel always seemed kind, calm, and reasonable. It was difficult to believe. But Even if the woman scolded him at home, that was no excuse for behaving uncontrollably in public places and posing a danger to strangers. It turned out that Randy's ex-girlfriend, Lissa Farley, had been trying to contact him around the time of the abuse. They had been together in high school, but their romance did not work out, and fate separated their paths. Lissa married, divorced, and later remembered Randy, determined to meet him again and give their relationship another chance in adulthood. She learned about Randy's marital problems and assumed that the whole situation would end in divorce. In fact, she was shocked by the recent events in Randy's life and thought she could help him get his life back on track. Lissa had known him for more than a decade. They had been friends for a long time. She claimed that there was not a single episode in Randy's biography that could be considered a warning sign for violent revenge. She knew him as a mature and intelligent man who valued his family and loved his child. At the same time, she also knew the other side of him. According to her, he had lived for a very long time with an alcoholic father who treated him badly. As he got older, he had a very strained relationship with his mother. That was one of the reasons he did not want his daughter, Natalie, placed in the care of his own family members. Lissa suspected that his problems and difficult childhood may have broken him, and that the man needed help. Employees of the company from which the killer had been dismissed claimed that they knew about his problems with illegal substances. According to colleagues and even management, he had admitted long before the incident that he struggled with addiction. Nevertheless, it was believed that he had overcome these problems and their consequences in the years before the attack. But then he relapsed. What was the real reason for this man's misconduct, which ultimately led to the murder of his wife? Immediately after his arrest, 42-year-old Randy was charged with first-degree murder. He was also accused of endangering the life of a child, which became the second charge. In addition, the man was accused of tampering with evidence because he had tried to dispose of bloodstains and the blanket in which the victim had been wrapped. Investigators were certain that he intended to eliminate evidence of the crime and then flee, presumably to Mexico, with the money he had prepared. Bail was initially set at $2.5 million. He sat behind bars and awaited trial. By the end of June 2013, the man still had not pleaded guilty to all charges. His lawyer was one of Nashville's best defense attorneys, David Rabin. Rabin sought a reduction in bail and the man's release under house arrest, arguing that Randy was actually a victim of his wife's alleged tyranny. The defense attorney insisted that despite the discovery of a large amount of cash in Randy's car, no documents, cards, or other evidence were found to indicate that the perpetrator intended to leave the city. The defense argued that his client had enough time to flee, but did not. The prosecution held a different opinion for a long time. There was even a witness who claimed to have heard about plans to flee to Mexico, but that statement later turned out to be false. The mother of the deceased filed a civil lawsuit against her son-in-law because she wanted to prevent him from accessing financial accounts and assets that he and his wife had acquired together. She feared that Randy would once again evade justice by bribing everyone he could reach with the family's assets. She was certain that this was the only way the criminal had previously escaped punishment for his offenses. Rachel's mother hoped that he simply would not be able to bear the court costs and that he would receive what he deserved for the heinous act he had committed. Despite everything, time worked in the prisoner's favor. His lawyer managed to significantly reduce his bail to $750,000. Randy immediately posted this amount. Since his mother-in-law's lawsuit was still pending, this meant that he would have to wait at least another year and a half for his hearing. The trial was scheduled for September 2014. Surprisingly, the judge even allowed Randy to continue living in the house where his wife's murder had been committed. However, the man had numerous difficulties to deal with because the bail conditions still applied. He was not allowed to leave the house without notifying the Brentwood police at least 24 hours in advance. During this period, he always had to have a lawyer with him and had to wear a GPS monitoring device in the form of an ankle bracelet. Contact with his daughter and with the family members of his murdered wife was prohibited. Meanwhile, his mother-in-law continued to fight and awaited a judgment in the civil case. She eventually succeeded in obtaining a court restraining order on the couple's property. Nevertheless, Randy simply entered the house and took his belongings and clothes. When this came to light, he faced a new charge of contempt of court. Thanks to the efforts of his lawyer, however, this charge was dismissed. Such brazenness seemed unthinkable, but it later appeared that the criminal got away with many things, thanks to his money and his connections to the Governor's Club and local law enforcement circles. Investigations revealed that Randy had not simply fled into the woods after the murder. Several neighbors said that on the morning after the massacre, they discovered that someone had tried to break into their homes through garage doors and regular doors. Police officers checked the club's video recordings and found that it was Randy who had tried to break into a neighbor's house. His exact intentions remain unclear, but he posed a significant danger. He denied these facts himself, and gradually, everything was covered up. The judge's decisions, which allowed a dangerous criminal who had lost control of himself to remain free for a year and a half, were long criticized and rightly questioned. Randy became a true example of how fatal impunity can be. He remained free during that entire period thanks to a good lawyer who gave him the chance to await trial outside jail. Only months later, in December 2013, he was caught trying to enter a residential complex in another suburb of Nashville. It was a rather bizarre incident reported by one of the residents of the apartment building. According to him, Randy tried to gain access by banging on the door and pretending to be a police officer. The resident sensed that something was wrong. When he did not open the door to the uninvited guest, he heard him doing the same at other apartments, so he called the police. When the police arrived, they found Randy once again heavily intoxicated. The very next day, the judge decided to revoke his bail. Amazingly, the manic alcohol incidents continued both before and after the murder of his wife. It is hard to imagine the fear his neighbors lived with over the previous year, especially after learning that Randy had been released on bail and was living in the family villa next to them. It seemed that the killer would soon receive what he deserved, because under Tennessee law, his offense could have carried the death penalty. But his experienced defense attorney had an excellent plan. Unexpectedly for the victim's family, Randy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and child neglect on September 15, 2014. As a result, he received only 25 years in prison. Strangely, this was not even half of the maximum sentence for this catalog of offenses. The perpetrator could have received 60 years in prison. Furthermore, the killer's lawyer managed to secure the possibility of parole, which may become possible under the condition of good behavior. Since Randy was 42 years old at the time of sentencing, he may have the opportunity to be released around the age of 60. During sentencing, Randy said the following words: "Rachel, I promised to love and cherish you, and I betrayed all of that. I will live with this anguish forever. No prison is worse than the one I have imposed on myself. To all of Rachel's relatives and friends, I am truly sorry that I caused you so much pain and so many terrible moments." The murdered woman's mother, Betty, regarded the court ruling as a personal insult. She turned several times to higher authorities in an attempt to obtain a review and a harsher sentence, but everything was in vain. Randy himself described his lenient sentence as an opportunity to save at least one of Natalie's parents. Naturally, Rachel's family was shocked by these decisions during the investigation and trial. Her mother and brother turned to the public through the media to express their dissatisfaction. They also emphasized their grief over the brutal and tragic death of a beautiful and successful woman, and protested against the absurd decisions of a justice system that seemed to be on the perpetrator's side. Randy was never punished for many of the other allegations and prior offenses in the way Rachel's family believed he should have been. Randy's lawyer responded to the accusations by conveying his client's sincere regret and condolences to the victim's family. However, Betty heard only empty phrases that neither absolved the perpetrator nor comforted her, and certainly could not bring Rachel back. Natalie was placed in Betty's custody. The child would inherit her parents' entire estate when she came of age. The victim's mother remained convinced that the only reason for her son-in-law's lenient sentence was his connections and his money. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.